The cafe was called The Ridgeline, and on any other evening, Ethan Calloway would have appreciated it. The wide windows faced the frozen roaring Fork River, and the late afternoon light, what little survived the overcast December sky, fell across the polished oak tables in long, amber strips. Snow pressed against the glass from outside, thick and relentless, the kind that softened every sound and made Aspen feel like a snow globe someone had shaken and forgotten. Ethan sat at a corner table, back to the wall the way he always preferred, a habit left over from years of boardrooms and deals where he liked to see the entire room. His coat was folded on the chair beside him. His coffee sat untouched, cooling in a ceramic mug. He'd ordered it out of obligation more than desire something to do with his hands while he waited. He checked his watch. 12 minutes past 6. He'd arrived at 5:50. He was always early. It wasn't a virtue so much as a compulsion. Ethan Calloway did not leave outcomes to chance, including social ones. The blind date had been arranged by his sister-in-law, Patricia, who had approached it with the kind of missionary determination he found both annoying and, if he was being truthful with himself, oddly touching. She'd slid the matchmaking into a Sunday dinner conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had been planning it for weeks. "She's remarkable, Ethan. A veterinary technician. She volunteers at the rescue center out by the industrial district. Her name is Clara Bennett. Just one coffee. Noah needs you to try." He hadn't been able to argue with the last part. Noah was 9 years old and hadn't laughed, genuinely laughed. The kind that started in the belly and took over everything in 14 months. Ethan had counted. So here he sat, back to the wall. 14 minutes past 6. He thought about Amelia. He did that a lot in situations like this. Situations that would have embarrassed him if she could see them. Sitting in a cafe, waiting for a stranger. Because his sister-in-law believed that love was something that could be arranged on a Tuesday evening over artisanal coffee. Amelia would have laughed at him. Not cruelly, she didn't have a cruel bone in her, but with that particular warmth she'd always had. The one that said, "I see you trying and it's both ridiculous and wonderful." He missed her every single day. 3 years since the cancer had taken her. 3 years of being very good at being alone. He had mastered it with the same methodical competence he applied to everything else: the company, the charitable foundation, Noah's schedule. He had organized grief the way he organized quarterly reports, in neat columns, manageable sections, actionable items. See Dr. Hartwell every 2 weeks. Exercise. Sleep 8 hours. Be present for Noah. He had not been present for Noah. Not really. He had been there, physically, consistently, but presence was not the same thing as warmth, and somewhere in the second year he had understood the distinction and not known what to do about it. He checked his watch again. 15 minutes past 6. He began, quietly and without drama, to fold his coat over his arm. The cafe door opened. A gust of winter air slammed through the room with enough force to rattle the chalkboard menu above the counter. Snow swept across the polished floor in a small white wave. Several people looked up from their tables. The woman in the doorway stood for a moment with her hand still on the door handle, breathing hard. Her dark coat was soaked through across one shoulder and torn at the left sleeve, not a clean tear, but the ragged kind that spoke of something snagged on metal or concrete. Her boots, dark brown and sensible, were caked in slush and ice. Her hair was half free from whatever she'd put it in before leaving home, dark strands plastered to one cheek from the wet. Her left hand had a long red scrape across the knuckles, the skin broken in 2 places. She looked up. Her eyes found him, or found the table Patricia had described, and her expression did something complicated. Not embarrassment. Not the practiced composure of someone performing an apology. Something rawer than that. She looked the way a person looks after they have just done something frightening and come through the other side and have not yet had time to decide how to feel about it. Ethan sat back down. He didn't fully understand why. He did it before the thought was complete. "I'm sorry." she said, arriving at the table, still unwrapping a scarf that had done very little good. I know how this looks. I'm 20 minutes late, and I look like I fell off a bridge. Did you? He asked. She blinked. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch even her off guard. Not exactly. Close. She sat down. A waitress materialized immediately, and Clara, he assumed this was Clara, asked for hot tea and a glass of water in the distracted way of someone still partially somewhere else. There's a pedestrian bridge, she said. The one over the creek at Monarch Street. You know it? He nodded. I was crossing it on the way here. There's a husky on the lower embankment. She paused to blow on her fingers, which were red from cold. He'd fallen through a section of fence, old chain link, rusted through at the bottom and gotten his hind leg caught in it. On the ice shelf, just sitting there, making this sound. She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. I called animal control. They said 40 minutes minimum, maybe longer with the weather. Ethan looked at the scrape on her hand. So you went down. The embankment's steep. There's a service access point about 30 yards east, but the gate was padlocked, so I went over the railing. She said it the way she might say I took the stairs. The ice on the slope was worse than I expected. That's how I got, she gestured vaguely at her shoulder, her sleeve. And the dog? Atlas is fine. Something settled in her expression. He's at Summit Creek Clinic now. Dr. Okonkwo is the overnight vet on Tuesdays. She'll check the leg. I texted her from the bridge. She paused. I named him Atlas while I was sitting on the ice with him. I don't know why. He seemed like he needed a name. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had come here expecting to perform an hour of polite conversation with someone his sister-in-law approved of, exchange surface-level pleasantries about careers and hobbies, and leave with the quiet satisfaction of having tried. He had not expected to sit across from a woman who named injured dogs while sitting on frozen embankments and said I don't know why about it in a tone that suggested she understood perfectly well. You said 40 minutes, he said. Animal control would have reached him eventually. Clara looked at him steadily. He was cold and afraid and in pain. 40 minutes is a very long time when you're cold and afraid and in pain. She picked up her tea. Some things can't wait for convenience. He found he had nothing to say to that. They talked for 2 hours. He learned her in fragments, the way you learn anyone worth knowing, not in a linear biography, but in the textures and edges of things. The details that surface naturally when a conversation finds its stride. Clara Bennett had grown up in the foster care system in Colorado. 4 placements between the ages of 7 and 17. She had studied veterinary technology at Colorado State because animals, she said, were honest in ways that people often were not. Pain in an animal was uncomplicated. You could do something about it. She lived in a 4th-floor walk-up on the east side of town. She had 2 cats named Edison and Clementine. She drove a 2009 Subaru with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that only worked if you hit the dashboard on the left side first. She earned $32,000 a year and spent a significant fraction of it on foster animals that the shelter couldn't hold. She had no trust fund, no safety net, no family member she could call if the car broke down on a cold Tuesday night. She asked him what he did. He told her, CEO of Callaway Holdings, diversified commercial real estate and infrastructure development, 3,000 employees across 7 states. She nodded the way people nod when they have no specific frame of reference for a number and are being polite about it. And before that? She asked. He looked at her. Most people, when they learned what he did, didn't ask before that. I worked construction, he said. My father's company. Summers through college, then full-time after. We built foundations. Literally. A pause. My wife used to say that was why I was the way I was. That once you build enough foundations, you start to see everything in terms of load-bearing walls. He hadn't meant to mention Amelia. The sentence had come out on its own, unhurried, and he watched Clara's face carefully to see what she'd do with it. She didn't lean forward with curated sympathy. She didn't redirect the conversation. She said, simply, "Is she gone? 3 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry." She said it quietly, without ornamentation. "I have a son," he said, "Noah. He's 9. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully name. Not pity. Something older than that, and more personal. "How's he doing?" Ethan stopped. He rarely answered this question honestly. He had a repertoire of acceptable responses. "He's resilient. He's doing well. Kids are adaptable." All of them were partially true and essentially false. "He's very quiet these days," he said instead. "He laughs at things he's supposed to laugh at. He does well in school. But there's something somewhere that used to be lit up. It's like the power has been turned down." Clara held her mug in both hands and looked at him across the steam. "You know what I've learned about grieving animals?" she said. "The ones that shut down the most completely are usually the ones that loved the hardest. The depth of the withdrawal corresponds to the depth of the attachment." She paused. "I think that's probably true of people, too." He thought about Noah at 6. Before Amelia got sick, the way he used to run down the hallway of the penthouse in his socks and slam into door frames at full speed because he couldn't be bothered to slow down. The raw kinetic joy of that kid. Where had he gone? "You can't protect someone from pain," Clara said carefully. "By protecting them from love." He felt it land somewhere behind his sternum. The particular, quiet impact of a true thing. He had expected dinner, the reservation at Element 47 that Patricia had suggested, white tablecloths, and a sommelier who knew him by name. Instead, somewhere in the third cup of tea, Clara mentioned offhandedly that she had to stop by Northridge Rescue Center in the morning to check on the 7 puppies that had come in during the storm. "7?" he said. "Someone left them in a box behind the gas station off Highway 82. During the blizzard 2 nights ago." Her voice was level, but her jaw did the thing again, the brief tightening. "They're doing okay now. Lab mix, probably 6 weeks. But they need socialization time or they get anxious." He heard himself say, "Could I bring Noah?" She looked at him for a moment. Not with surprise, exactly. More like she was assessing something, taking the actual measure of the question rather than just its surface. "The shelter's not a field trip," she said carefully. "It's a working facility. There are animals that are scared or recovering or in pain. It requires a certain emotional steadiness." "He has that," Ethan said. And then, surprising himself, "More than I do." "Probably. Sunday morning?" she said. Sunday. He drove home through falling snow, the city muffled and soft outside his window, and thought about the fact that he had just made a plan that involved getting up early on a weekend and driving to an industrial district in winter weather to visit dogs, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Interested. Simply, cleanly, quietly interested in what came next. Northridge Rescue Center occupied what had once been a light manufacturing facility in the industrial section west of downtown, a long, low building with a corrugated metal roof and chain-link kennels along the rear that, in winter, had to be heated by portable units that hummed and rattled like old machinery. The interior smelled of antiseptic and animal bedding and, underneath that, something warmer. Sawdust and coffee from the small break room where volunteers gathered before shifts. Clara met them at the side entrance at 9:15. She was wearing work clothes, dark green scrubs under a fleece vest, heavy boots, her hair pulled back. She looked, Ethan noticed, completely comfortable in a way she hadn't quite been in the cafe. The way certain people only fully inhabit themselves in their own territory. Noah stood beside Ethan in his winter coat, backpack on one shoulder out of habit. His expression, contained in the way it usually was, now watchful, quiet, polite, the expression that made Ethan's chest hurt. "Noah," Clara said, crouching slightly so she was closer to his eye level without making a production of it. You ever been around a lot of animals at once? Noah shook his head. Okay, a few rules and then we go in. She held up one finger. Move slowly. No sudden sounds. The animals in here have had confusing lives recently and their nervous systems are working hard. Second finger. If an animal turns away from you, that means they need space. We respect that without taking it personally. Third finger. The puppies are in the east room. They have no such concerns. They will absolutely take it personally if you don't pet them. Noah almost smiled. Almost. The shelter held 43 dogs and 61 cats that Sunday morning, and it smelled and sounded like what it was. A place doing its best with limited resources, populated by animals in various states of confusion and recovery. Ethan walked through it with the quiet attention he gave to any space he entered. Noting the infrastructure problems, the HVAC unit rattling near the ceiling in the main kennel corridor, the lighting that flickered in the far corridor, the folding tables held together with zip ties in the supply room. The east room was warm. It had been partitioned off with plywood and lined with blankets, and in the center, in a large whelping pen, were 7 puppies approximately the size and color of caramel corn. They were sleeping in a pile, breathtakingly concentrated, limbs tangled together in the unconscious architecture of the very young. Noah crouched at the edge of the pen. One of the puppies opened its eyes dark, unfocused, ancient-looking in the way of very young animals, and regarded him with grave interest. Then it climbed over 2 siblings and walked in his direction with enormous effort, its paws too large for its body, falling once and getting up again with the profound commitment of something that has not yet learned that falling is worth noticing. It reached the edge of the pen and looked up at Noah. Noah put his hand over the edge, palm down. The puppy sniffed it. Then it put its chin on his fingers and closed its eyes. Ethan watched his son's face. The expression that broke through was not the curated politeness of the past 14 months. It was something that went all the way down the raw, unfiltered kind of feeling that Noah had stopped showing anywhere, to anyone, as if he'd decided that being seen was something that cost too much. His eyes filled up. He didn't cry. He just looked at the sleeping puppy on his hand with an expression that said everything he hadn't been able to say. Clara, standing slightly behind Ethan, said nothing. She understood, he thought, when silence was the only thing that fit. In the older dog kennels, there was a 10-year-old arthritic German shepherd named Atlas. Ethan stopped in front of his kennel. The dog lay on a thick orthopedic mat, not sleeping, just resting with the careful economy of something that has learned to conserve its energy. His muzzle was gray. His eyes, when they opened to regard Ethan, were amber and intelligent, and very, very tired. He came in 3 months ago, Clara said quietly. His family moved. Couldn't take him. He's the one from the bridge? She nodded. Summit Creek released him to us last week. He's stable, but the arthritis is significant. He gets medication twice a day. He's a little hard to place because most families want younger dogs. Ethan looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back at him with the measured gaze of a creature that has been disappointed enough times to have made peace with expectations. He looks like someone, Ethan said. He thought about it. Someone who's still here, he said finally, but only barely. Clara looked at him sideways. Some days that's enough, she said. The trouble arrived at 11:15 in the form of a man named Gary Willard, who came through the front door with the particular energy of someone who has been building himself up for a confrontation the entire drive over. He was in his mid-40s, heavyset, wearing a Carhartt jacket and carrying a leash that had seen better days. "I want my dog back," he said to the volunteer at the desk, loudly enough to carry through the building. The black lab. I surrendered him 2 weeks ago, and I changed my mind. Ethan was in the supply room with Noah, refilling water stations. He heard it and stepped into the corridor. Clara was already at the front desk. What she did in the next 10 minutes was, Ethan would think later, one of the more quietly impressive things he'd ever watched a person do. She didn't escalate. She didn't become defensive. She moved to the front counter with the calm, deliberate pace of someone who has navigated this specific terrain before, and she looked at Gary Willard directly and said, "Tell me about him." The man blinked. "Your dog. Tell me about him." "What's his name?" A pause. "Bear. How long have you had him?" 6 years. Something shifted in the man's posture. "He was my wife's dog. She left 3 months ago. I kept thinking I couldn't handle it, having him around. Reminded me." He stopped, his jaw worked. "But I was wrong. I want him back." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand," she said, and meant it. Ethan could tell the difference. "Here's where we are, Gary. When an animal is surrendered, there's a legally required hold period before we can process adoption or transfer. Bear has been here 2 weeks. That means the hold is complete, and he has been through our intake process." She paused. "What I can tell you is that Bear has not been adopted. He is still here, and I can tell you that a reunification request, an owner requesting return of their animal, is something we take seriously and process with full documentation." She held his gaze. "I need you to fill out some paperwork, and I need to have a conversation with you about what changed and what resources are available to you." That conversation is a requirement, not a judgment. Gary Willard, who had arrived prepared to fight, stood in the lobby for a moment. Then, silently, he sat down in one of the plastic chairs by the door. After he left with an appointment scheduled for Wednesday, and Bear still in his kennel but with a hold placed on his file, Ethan found Clara in the corridor, refilling food bins with the focused efficiency of someone on to the next task. "You've done that before," he said. "Surrenders happen for a lot of reasons," she said. "Most of them are people in pain, not people who don't care." She set down the scoop. "If you assume the worst, you lose the dog and the person. If you assume the best, sometimes you save both." He stood in the corridor with the HVAC rattling above him and thought, "I built foundations for 20 years and I have never seen anyone lay one faster." He drove home past the frozen river, Noah asleep in the passenger seat before they reached the highway. The penthouse was quiet. He carried Noah to his room without waking him, which he'd been doing since Noah was 3 and which still felt, in a specific wordless way, like one of the most important things he did. He stood in the doorway for a moment after. His son's face in sleep was unguarded in a way it wasn't when he was awake. The tension around his eyes, the careful social calibration, all of it released. He looked 9. He looked like himself. Ethan went to his office. He didn't turn on the overhead light, just the lamp on the desk, the one Amelia had chosen because she said the overhead made him look like he was being interrogated. He sat. He thought about what Clara had said in the cafe. You can't protect someone from pain by protecting them from love. He'd been doing exactly that, to Noah and to himself. He had built a grief that was architecturally sound, load-bearing walls, reinforced foundation, nothing that would collapse. Nothing that could collapse. And he had handed Noah a version of that structure and called it stability. Amelia had said something to him in the last weeks, in the hospital, when they had run out of things to pretend about and the conversations had become very quiet and very true. She'd said, "Don't let grief turn you into a man I wouldn't recognize." He hadn't thought about that in months. He pulled up his laptop. He searched Northridge Rescue Center. Their operating budget was $340,000 annually. They had 2 full-time staff members and relied on approximately 60 volunteers. Their HVAC system had last been replaced in 2011. Their facility lease ran through 2027. He opened a new document. He'd established the Callaway Foundation 2 years ago as a vehicle for estate planning and tax strategy. It had donated to a handful of organizations, a hospital wing, a youth sports league, a scholarship fund at his alma mater. The kinds of things that looked good in the annual report. He began typing something different. A proposal to reallocate 15% of the Foundation's annual disbursements to animal welfare organizations in Pitkin County, with Northridge Rescue as the primary beneficiary. A multi-year commitment, infrastructure upgrades, staff salary supplementation, equipment. He didn't send it. He saved it to a folder and stared at it for a while. Then he texted Patricia. "Thank you," he typed. She replied 4 minutes later with a string of punctuation marks that he chose to interpret as enthusiasm. They had dinner the following Friday at a place called Trattoria del Ponte, a narrow Italian restaurant on the east end of downtown that had been in the same family for 22 years and looked it in the best way. Candles in wine bottles, handwritten specials on a chalkboard, the smell of garlic and butter reaching you before you opened the door. Clara came in a simple blue dress with long sleeves, and she came alone this time, on time, without incident, and she sat across from him with the same directness she brought to everything, and ordered the house red without looking at the wine list. "Tell me something true," she said, when the bread arrived. He looked at her. "That's a first date question. This is our third meeting. We should be past pretense by now." He thought about it. "I've been building walls for 3 years," he said. "I got very good at it. I told myself it was for Noah that stability required structure, but I think I was just afraid of losing someone again, of caring enough to lose someone again." She turned her wine glass in slow circles on the table. "I don't get attached to things I can't survive losing," she said. "I learned that young, in the system. You move enough times, you stop unpacking your whole box." A pause. The animals were safer for a long time. They needed me. That was enough. And now? She looked up. "I don't know yet, but I think there's a difference between choosing simplicity and choosing it because you're afraid of what wanting more costs." Outside, snow had begun again, drifting past the window in slow, heavy flakes, turning the streetlights into something approximating halos. He told her about Amelia in a way he hadn't told anyone, not the narrative he'd developed for social situations, the practiced, compassionate summary, but the actual version. The diagnosis in March, and the way it had taken him 3 weeks to stop doing research and start being present. The last 6 months. The conversation about grief. The specific quality of the loss, not the event of it, but the ongoing texture. The way absence wasn't a single thing, but accumulated in small ambushes. A coffee mug, a television program, a specific quality of winter light. Clara listened the way very few people listened, without preparing her response, without managing her own emotional reaction. Just hearing. Control felt like safety, he said, after she was gone. Scheduling everything, managing everything. But it was just another kind of prison. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been in the same one." They walked out into the snow at 10 o'clock. The street was nearly empty, the downtown quiet in the particular way of mountain towns in winter. She stopped under a street lamp and turned to look at him with the snow falling softly around her. He kissed her. She kissed him back, one hand briefly against his coat, and it was not dramatic, nothing that would play well with the clean narrative of grief giving way to love just true, just real, just two people choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to be present. She texted him 3 days later. "Can we talk?" They walked along the river trail, bundled against the cold, the roaring fork frozen to the edges and running dark and swift in the center channel. Clara walked with her hands in her pockets, and she said what she needed to say without preamble, which was one of the things he'd come to understand was simply how she was built. "I'm not equipped for what your life is," she said. "I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean it practically. You have a penthouse and a foundation and a company with 3,000 employees. I have a 4th-floor walk-up and 2 cats and a car that requires violence to heat." She stopped walking. "I'm not afraid of hard things. I've been doing hard things my whole life. But I'm afraid of changing into someone I don't recognize because I loved the wrong person in the wrong direction." He stood beside her on the frozen trail and looked at the river. "When Patricia told me about you," he said, "she said you were remarkable. I thought that was just what people said about women they were trying to fix up, but she was actually just describing you." He turned to face her. "I'm not asking you to change. I'm not asking you to be appropriate for my penthouse, or useful at company dinners, or interested in quarterly reports. I have enough people in my life who exist in that context." He paused. "You're the first person in 3 years who has made me feel like the context doesn't have to be everything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Noah," she said, "he asked me on Sunday night if the rescue center lets kids volunteer," Ethan said. "When I said I'd ask, he went and looked up what time the shelter opens on Saturdays." He let that sit for a moment. He hasn't looked something up out of curiosity in over a year. Clara pressed her lips together. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said. "I'm asking you to let what's real be real, at the pace it actually happens. Not faster than that, not slower." She started walking again, and after a moment he fell into step beside her. The river ran steadily in the silence between them. Above the trail, a hawk banked on a thermal, riding the cold air with the absolute economy of something that has learned to trust that the air will hold. "Okay," she said. It was quiet, but it was entirely hers. 5 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late January, Ethan and Noah drove to Northridge Rescue Center for the 7th time. The HVAC unit in the main kennel corridor had been replaced the previous week, funded by a grant from the Callaway Foundation's newly restructured community program. The lighting in the far corridor had been updated. The folding tables in the supply room had been replaced with proper shelving. Clara had accepted the upgrades with a combination of gratitude and the particular wariness of someone who has learned that gifts sometimes come with conditions, and Ethan had let her sit with it until she understood that these ones didn't. He had also been introduced, quietly and without ceremony, to the shelter's board of directors, and had proposed the multi-year partnership agreement he'd been refining since that night in his office. They'd approved it in December. The press release would go out the following week. Noah had been volunteering every Saturday for a month. He had a preferred assignment, socialization work with the kennel dogs, which required sitting on the floor of the kennel and simply being present, allowing anxious animals to approach or not as they chose. He was, Clara had told Ethan privately, extraordinarily good at it. The quality of patience Noah brought to those interactions was something she'd rarely seen in adult volunteers, let alone 9-year-olds. He had started laughing again. Not the performed version, the social one, but the real kind, surprised out of him by something a puppy did, or by a cat that sat on his head, or by the lab mix named Dumpster, who had learned to open his kennel door from the inside and was found repeatedly in the supply room eating donated kibble. Ethan had watched his son laugh at Dumpster for 3 full minutes and felt something in his own chest unknot that he had not known was knotted. Atlas was still in his kennel. Ethan stood in front of it on that Saturday morning, while Noah worked with the younger dogs in the East Room. Clara stood beside him. The old German shepherd lifted his head when he heard them coming. His amber eyes regarded them with the practiced reserve of a creature that has been wrong before about what hope costs. "You're taking him," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her. "Noah asked me on Thursday night. I told him I needed to think about it." "Did you?" "No," he said. "I already knew the answer. I just wanted to understand why it felt so easy." She was quiet for a moment. "Because it's not a risk anymore," he said. "Or it is, but I've stopped treating risk like the enemy." He looked at Atlas. "He needs someone. We need something to need." He paused. "It's not complicated when you let it be simple." Clara crouched and opened the kennel door, and Atlas came out slowly, with the careful dignity of his arthritic joints, and sniffed Ethan's hand with the gravity of a formal introduction. Then he sat, just sat, leaning very slightly against Ethan's leg, not dramatically, not needily, just present. Noah appeared in the corridor doorway, breathless from running. He saw Atlas. He came forward slowly, the way Clara had taught all of them. No sudden movements, no pressure, just presence. He crouched and held out his hand, and Atlas turned and sniffed it, and then did, to Noah, what he had not done to anyone at the shelter in 3 months. He licked his face. Noah laughed, loud and helpless and from somewhere completely true. Ethan stood in the corridor of a shelter in an industrial district in Aspen, Colorado, with snow falling outside and the HVAC humming steadily above him and his son's real laughter filling the space, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not the careful management of absence but the actual presence of something alive. That night, after Noah was in bed and Atlas was sleeping on the orthopedic mat they'd bought that afternoon on the drive home, Ethan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse and looked at the mountain. The sky had cleared, the way it sometimes did in Aspen after a long stretch of weather, and the stars above the ridgeline were the particular clear and numerous kind that only appears when the air is very cold and very clean. He picked up his phone. He typed, and then stopped, and then typed again. He once said some things can't wait for convenience. He looked at what he'd written for a moment. Then he added, "I'm done waiting." He sent it. Behind him, Atlas shifted in his sleep and exhaled slowly. The long